The parking lot at Hargrove & Associates smelled like exhaust and entitlement, and on a Tuesday morning in late October, both were in full supply. Gordon Finch pulled his 1969 Ford Torino into space 47, the same space he'd used for 11 years, tucked near the stairwell where the fluorescent had been flickering since 2019 and nobody had bothered to fix it. The car was brown. Or it had been brown once. Now it was the color of something left too long in the rain, which was exactly what had happened to it, repeatedly, over the course of 4 decades. The rear quarter panel had a patch of rust the size of a dinner plate. The passenger mirror was held in place with electrical tape. The exhaust pipe had developed a low, steady grumble that people in the office had started calling the warning bell, because when they heard it pulling into the lot, they knew Gordon was 5 minutes away. Gordon didn't mind. He was 53 years old, worked in logistics coordination on the 3rd floor, had raised 2 daughters on his own since his wife passed in 2014, and he had long ago stopped caring what his car said about him to people who needed cars to say things. He locked it with the key. The fob had stopped working in 2021, tucked his lunch bag under his arm, and walked toward the entrance. That was when he heard the laughter. It wasn't mean laughter, not exactly. It was the kind that doesn't think about itself. Relaxed, offhand, the laughter of someone who has never had to worry about the thing they're laughing at. Gordon. Sylvia Crane was standing near the entrance with 2 people Gordon didn't recognize, both in suits that still had the press in them. She was Senior Vice President of Client Relations and had been at Hargrove for 3 years, which was long enough to redecorate her office twice and short enough that she still mispronounced the name of the company's longest-running account. She had the kind of confidence that came not from competence but from the simple, unexamined belief that she deserved to be wherever she was. "Is that actually yours?" She was pointing at the Torino. Gordon turned back to look at it as if checking. "It is." One of the suited men let out a short laugh. The other pressed his lips together in an expression that tried to be polite and wasn't. "Does it run?" Sylvia asked. She wasn't smiling anymore, but the amusement was still in her voice, sitting just below the surface. "It runs. I mean, I'm not trying to be rude," she said, in the tone people use when they are absolutely trying to be rude. "But HR got a complaint from the building manager last week about a vehicle in the lot that was, I think the word used was leaking, and I see there's something on the concrete under space 47. Gordon looked at the faint stain on the concrete. It had been there since 2020. The car had been serviced. The stain had not gone anywhere because concrete absorbs things and keeps them. "That stain predates any leak," he said. "The car was serviced in June." Sylvia tilted her head slightly. "Right? Okay," she said it the way people say okay when they've already decided they don't believe you. Then she turned back to her guests and held the door open, and the 3 of them went inside, and the conversation moved on in the easy way conversations move on when they are not your problem. Gordon stood in the parking lot for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he followed them inside. The thing about Gordon Finch was that he was not a man who talked about himself. This was not false modesty. It was not performance. It was simply that his interior life had been shaped by a particular kind of Canadian reticence, the kind that comes from small-town Ontario, from a father who showed love by fixing things rather than saying things, from a childhood where you kept your head down and did the work and trusted that the work would speak eventually. He had grown up in Timmins, moved to Hamilton for university, ended up in Ottawa because of a woman named Carol. No, not Carol, that was someone else. Because of his wife, Louise, who had grown up here and whose mother was still alive in Canada and who had needed to be near her. He had stayed because the girls were settled, because the job was steady, because Ottawa in October had a particular quality of light that he had never been able to find anywhere else. He did not talk about the Torino. He didn't talk about how he had found it in a collapsed barn outside Cochrane in 1998, half buried in hay and rust and 20 years of neglect. He didn't talk about spending the better part of a decade, evenings and weekends, restoring the engine by hand. He didn't talk about the summer of 2003, when Louise would bring sandwiches to the garage and sit on an overturned bucket and read while he worked, and how those evenings were some of the best of his life. He didn't talk about the reason the restoration had stopped, the real reason, the one that had nothing to do with money. He didn't talk about what was under the hood. Sylvia Crane had a gift for turning small moments into institutional policy. By Thursday, the parking lot incident had become a conversation. By Friday, it was a memo. The memo was careful. It did not mention Gordon Finch by name. It did not mention the Torino specifically, but it referenced vehicles in poor cosmetic condition that may affect the professional presentation of the building exterior, and suggested that employees consider whether their vehicle meets the standards of a client-facing environment. The building was not client-facing. Clients entered from Richmond Road, not from the staff parking lot. Gordon read the memo at his desk, set it down, and went back to the logistics report he was working on. His colleague Pete Baxter, who sat 2 desks over and had been at Hargrove for 22 years, rolled his chair across the aisle. "That's about your car. I know. You going to do anything about it?" Gordon considered this. "It's a memo about cosmetic standards in a non-client-facing parking lot." "No, I'm not going to do anything about it." Pete nodded slowly. "She asked me about it, you know. Asked if it was a safety concern. I told her I'd driven in worse, and she looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language." Gordon allowed himself a small smile. The thing about Sylvia Crane was that she was not a bad person. She was something more complicated than that. She was a person who had organized her entire understanding of the world around surfaces, and who genuinely could not conceive of why someone would choose, if they had any choice at all, to drive what she had described to her assistant as something you'd see in a ditch on the 17. She didn't know what she didn't know. That was the charitable interpretation, and Gordon was by disposition a charitable man. The client visit happened on a Wednesday in early November. Hargrove had been trying to land the Bellwood account for 8 months. Bellwood Industrial was a mid-sized manufacturing firm out of Sudbury that was expanding its Ottawa presence, and the contract was significant enough that the senior partners had rearranged the office furniture and ordered new coffee for the meeting room. Sylvia had been managing the relationship and had brought in an outside consultant named Derek Faulkner to help with the presentation. Gordon had nothing to do with any of this. He was in logistics. He pulled into Space 47 at 7:43 a.m. earlier than usual because he had a report due, and went up to his desk and did not think about the Bellwood meeting. What happened next he would only hear about in pieces. The Bellwood delegation arrived at 9. There were 3 of them: the operations director, a junior analyst, and the man himself, the founder and CEO of Bellwood Industrial, a man named Hugh Bellwood. Hugh was 71 years old, had started the company with a used drill press and a rented warehouse in 1979, and had the face of a man who had spent meaningful portions of his life outdoors in northern Ontario weather. The group was being walked through the building by Sylvia when Hugh Bellwood stopped walking. He had come to the window at the end of the second-floor corridor, the one that looked down into the staff parking lot. "Excuse me," he said. Sylvia turned. Of course, Hugh was staring down at the parking lot, specifically at Space 47. "That car," he said. Sylvia looked. "The Torino." She felt a small familiar prickle of irritation. "Yes," she said. "We're actually working on our parking lot standards. We have a memo in circulation." "That's a 69 Torino," Hugh said. He wasn't talking to her anymore. He walked to the window and put one hand on the glass. His operations director, a man named Dave Cito, came to stand beside him. Both of them were quiet for a moment. "I haven't seen one in that condition." "And Dave, have you ever seen one in that condition?" Dave said he had not. Sylvia looked between them. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what." "That's not a restoration," Hugh said. "That's an original. Look at the patina on the quarter panel. You can't manufacture that. That's 40 years of actual Ontario weather on original paint." He paused. "Someone's been maintaining the mechanical without touching the body." "Do you know whose car that is?" Sylvia opened her mouth and then closed it. Pete Baxter knocked on Gordon's office door at 9:47 a.m. "The SVP wants you in the second-floor boardroom." Gordon looked up from his report. "Why?" Pete had an expression Gordon couldn't quite read. "There are clients. One of them is very interested in your car." Gordon closed the report, straightened his badge, and went downstairs. He walked into the boardroom to find Sylvia Crane standing near the window with 3 men he didn't know. She had a particular expression on her face. A recalibration was happening in real time, and she was not enjoying the process. "Gordon Finch," she said. "This is Hugh Bellwood." Hugh Bellwood crossed the room and shook Gordon's hand with both of his. He was a compact, solid man with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that were paying close attention. "That's your Torino in the lot?" "It is," Gordon said. 6969 GT Fastback. "Numbers matching." Something shifted in Hugh Bellwood's face. "Numbers matching," he repeated. He said it the way you say something when you already knew it was true and someone has just confirmed it. "How long have you had it?" "Found it in 98. Cochrane area, collapsed barn." Hugh exhaled slowly. "What was the condition?" Gordon described it. He described it the way he always described it. Without drama, factually, the way you describe a project to someone who will understand the scope without you needing to perform it. He told him about the engine, about the state of the block, about the years of work it had taken to get it running the way it ran. Hugh listened without interrupting, which in Gordon's experience was the mark of someone who actually understood what they were being told. "Who did the engine work?" Hugh asked. "Mostly me. Father helped when he was still around. Machine shop outside Timmins for the block." Hugh nodded. He paused. Then he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm not trying to pry. I'm asking because I know this car." He looked at Gordon steadily. "Did anyone ever tell you about the engine?" The boardroom was very quiet. Gordon held the older man's gaze for a moment. Then he said, "They did." Hugh let out a long, slow breath. "Who told you?" "The man I bought it from." The barn had been his father's. His father worked in sales, imported Italian cars in the late 60s. He said the car had been left by a customer who never came back for it. He said a man had come through the shop once. He described him as the Italian, and spent a morning looking at the engine and signed his name on the underside of the hood panel with a marker. The son thought his father had been telling stories. Had he been? Gordon's expression didn't change. "Would you like to come out to the lot?" They walked out together, Gordon and Hugh Bellwood and Dave Cito. Sylvia followed at a distance. She tried to make look casual and wasn't. Derek Faulkner, the consultant, came because he didn't know what else to do. Gordon unlocked the car with the key. He lifted the hood. The engine was immaculate. Not showroom immaculate, not chromed and polished and buffed for competition. It was working immaculate, the cleanliness of something that is deeply cared for by someone who understands its function, not its appearance. Every component was original. The block, the heads, the carburetor. Everything the way it had come from the factory in 1969, running perfectly, maintained by a man who had been doing this work since he was 24 years old. And on the inside surface of the hood panel, in a place you would only find if you were looking, in faded black marker, a signature. Hugh Bellwood leaned in close. He didn't touch it, he just looked at it for a long time. "Enzo Ferrari signed this car," Gordon said. It was the first time he had ever said it out loud to someone outside his family. Hugh straightened up. He put his hands in his coat pockets. Around them, the parking lot was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic on Richmond and the hum of the building's HVAC unit. "I know," Hugh said. "I know because my father was the sales manager at the import house that car passed through. I was 17 years old. I was there the day he came in." Gordon looked at him. "We didn't know who he was at first," Hugh said. "My father knew. My father always knew, but the rest of us, we thought he was just an older Italian man with very good shoes who was very interested in the American cars. He spent about 40 minutes with this one. He said something in Italian to my father that my father translated later as roughly, 'This is the engine that would embarrass us if we were not careful.' And then he signed the hood. The wind moved through the parking lot. The car left our shop about 6 months later," Hugh said. "Customer came in, paid cash, drove it away. My father always said it was the one that got away." He paused. "He passed in 2001. I spent years trying to trace it. The trail went cold somewhere up north." Gordon was quiet for a moment. "Cochrane," he said. "Your trail went cold at a collapsed barn outside Cochrane." Hugh looked at him. Something moved across the older man's face that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but lived in the space between them where things go when they are both at once. "I suppose it did," he said. Sylvia Crane stood at the edge of this exchange and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not guilt exactly. Guilt requires a specific accounting, and what Sylvia felt was less precise than that. It was more like the sensation of having walked confidently into a room and discovered it was much larger than she'd anticipated, that the walls she'd assumed were right there were actually much farther away, and that in the vastness of that space her confidence looked suddenly small. She had written a memo about this car. She had stood in this same parking lot and laughed. She had asked with the casual cruelty of someone who has never had to defend their choices whether it could still run. It had run for 11 years through Ottawa winters. It had been maintained by a man who had spent a decade restoring it with his own hands in a garage while his wife sat on an overturned bucket and read. It carried a signature that Hugh Bellwood, who had built a manufacturing empire from a rented warehouse and a used drill press, had spent 20 years trying to find. She had seen a rust stain. She had seen the surface and called it the story. There was nothing to say, not because the moment didn't call for something, but because anything she could produce would be too thin for what the moment required. She said nothing. Hargrove signed the Bellwood contract 3 weeks later. It was the largest account the firm had landed in 6 years. The senior partners attributed it to the presentation, to Derek Faulkner's consulting work, to months of relationship building. Hugh Bellwood, in a conversation with Gordon in the parking lot after the paperwork was signed, was more direct. "I do business with people I trust," he said. "And the first thing I trust is how a man takes care of something that other people have written off." They shook hands. "I'd like to ask you something," Hugh said, "and you can say no and it won't affect anything we've agreed to." Gordon waited. "I'd like to take a photograph of the signature. Just for myself, for my father, I suppose, though I know that sounds foolish." Gordon thought about Louise sitting on an overturned bucket with a book, a sandwich in her hand, the smell of oil and autumn through the open garage door. "It doesn't sound foolish at all," he said. He lifted the hood. Hugh Bellwood took the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he tucked his phone back in his coat pocket and looked at the sky over Ottawa with the expression of a man settling something that has been unsettled for a very long time. "Thank you," he said. Gordon lowered the hood, turned the key in the lock, and walked back toward the building, where 11 years of fluorescent lights and logistics reports and overheard comments about the stain in Space 47 were waiting for him, not as wounds, but simply as the texture of a life that had always known what it was worth, even when no one around it was paying the right kind of attention.